You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Hello everybody, this is your host Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House. Like every week, Asia House and the Baraka Trust, with the support of the Al Tajir Trust and the Al Khan Trust for Culture, bring you this series. Today, I have the privilege to have here with me Ulrike Al Khamis. Ulrike is the Director of the Collections and Public Programs at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. She's a well-known figure in the field of Islamic art history and has served as co-director at the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization, as well as senior strategic advisor to the Sharjah Museum's department in the United Arab Emirates. She began her career in Scotland, where she worked as principal curator for South Asia and the Middle East at the National Museums of Scotland, and also was curator for the Muslim art and culture at Glasgow Museums. And we thought it would be extremely interesting and entertaining to talk about a topic that many people do not necessarily associate to Islam, but in a certain way pervades many aspects of its culture, and this is the moon. Ulrike curated last year a sounded exhibition at the Aga Khan Museum on this topic, entitled The Moon, A Voyage Through Time, meant to discover the wonder, knowledge and beauty the moon has inspired through the ages. So, Ulrike, it's a real honor to have you here. And I wanted to ask you first, why this exhibition? Why did you choose this topic?
Well, thank you so much, Juan. And I have to really acknowledge my co-curator, Professor Christiane Gruber, with whom I worked on this exhibition. And the idea really came on the basis of the global preparations to acknowledge and celebrate the 50th anniversary of humanity's first landing on the moon on the 20th of July 1969. And what was fascinating to me was that, of course, the moon has always held fascination and wonder for humanity over millennia. But coming as an Islamic art historian from a particular perspective, I realized that no one had really ever explored the very central and important role of the moon in the spirituality, the sciences, and the arts of Muslim cultures across time and space. And therefore, Christiane and I then started to talk about the possibility of developing such an exhibition for the Aga Khan Museum. We managed to bring something together that really marks the very first exhibition of its kind, and very much used artifacts and works on paper, scientific instruments, and also contemporary art to really unpack some of the big themes around the moon that, of course, ultimately are not at all unique to Muslim cultures, but really interconnect them with the world at large.
Yes, indeed, and I think many of our listeners would be surprised of such links. Perhaps you could give us an introduction about the importance of the moon, particularly for the early Islamic societies.
Well, of course, early Muslims, like people all over the world at the most basic level, appreciated the moon very much because it gave relief from a very harsh daily environment, a hot, arid environment. It sweetly illuminates the night sky, and of course also most crucially it helps travelers to find their way in the darkness. But then within particularly Islamic context and the early days of Islam and the revelation of the Holy Quran, the moon also takes on a very central role as one of God's key celestial creations. And in the Quran, actually in Surah 21, verse 33, it is stated that God, who created the night and the day and the sun and the moon, all the heavenly bodies in an orbit are swimming. So the moon now becomes a central part of God's creation of the universe, creation of the heavens, and a natural and eternal interplayer with the sun. And of course, what is important is that it is stated in the Quran that all the celestial luminaries and sun and moon, above all of them, are created for the benefit of humanity. That means they are in service to them, to human beings, and not to be worshipped. That is a key difference of approach and vision to the attitudes of ancient civilizations that came before the revelation of the Quran in the 7th century. The Quran also talks about the moon as a timekeeper and as the one who determines the really calendar of the year and marking the start and end of important moments in the year, including, of course, the start and end of the fasting month of Ramadan and the annual pilgrimage or Hajj season. Finally, the moon is also seen as a beckoner of the end of time and the apocalypse. And there is one surah, one chapter in the Quran, Surah 54, Al Khamar, the moon, which actually starts with the hour is near, the moon is split. As the splitting of the moon is seen as a sign that the end of time is approaching. And through this association with the apocalypse, it also later became associated with the powers of the Prophet Muhammad, who of course was the recipient of the revelations of the Quran through the intermediary of the Archangel Gabriel. And the splitting of the moon becomes associated with the Prophet's proof of his prophethood or his status as a prophet, because when on one occasion he is challenged by doubters, he points the finger at the moon and causes it to split to prove that he has power over nature as invested by God. So religiously, the moon plays an important role. Practically, in the way people divided their life through the year, it played an important role. But it was also seen as a sign that God had invested or installed in the heavens for people to behold, to study, and to learn from, and to seek messages from the divine unity. And as a result, later on, Muslim cultures often turn to the moon to try to understand how earthly affairs might unfold and how it might give indications of future events, indications of impending disaster or crisis. And it also was seen as a marker of natural phenomena that in turn could have an impact also on the human condition and human health, in fact. That, of course, then led scholars and scientists to really invest much effort into studying the moon and its behavior across the heavens and across the year as it moved around and also, of course, interacted with the stars in the sky.
So we're talking about science. How did scientists engage with the moon to further our knowledge?
Of course, I mean, the early Muslims built on a combination of different previous perspectives on the moon. And of course, these perspectives came really from, again, three quarters. There was all the ancient knowledge, all the knowledge from ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, Greco-Roman, Persian, Indian knowledge. And that was added to very locally in the Arabian Peninsula with the knowledge of the nomads and the Arab Bedouins, who of course had to crisscross the very arid and difficult lands of the Arabian Peninsula by looking at the stars and the heavens in navigating their way. And then the third element, as I said, was also the instructions and the guidance given in the Quran. So these kind of pre-existing sources of knowledge were then built on. And there were, of course, many different reasons for that. First of all, yes, there was the faith aspect and the desire to know God's universe better and arrange life according to God's order and guidance. But there were also practical reasons, because as the Muslim empire expanded, navigation became more crucial, and the practical arrangement of the seasons, which of course are also then associated with harvest, with trade, with conveying commodities in line with the seasons, all that became, of course, increasingly important and affected the need to scientifically engage with the moon. The measuring of time for, again, calendar creation, and of course also for the determination of important religious and then later also, of course, stately events, depended on a clear understanding of the celestial movements. And rulers, for example, they saw themselves as moons, in a sense reflecting the divine light, but for their officials and for their subjects, they were the sun, and their officials, for example, were the moons who reflected their light. So the moon was ever present in people's perception of a perfect, God-given and God-invested life. And in that respect, the moon was also seen as a protector, if you like. And that is where its talismanic properties come in. And we have, and of course also it is used sometimes in stories that teach people about how to be wise and thoughtful in their actions. And I remember one story encapsulated in the Anwar Suhaili, which concerns a little duck that sees a reflection of the crescent moon in the water. And the duck keeps pecking at the little crescent because obviously it's shiny and shimmery. And of course, it keeps pecking and pecking, but it can never catch anything. So, and getting more and more hungry in the process. And then, of course, it comes to a point where it decides, well, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to pick at anything that's shiny anymore because it's just illusionary. So next time, a little silvery fish swims by, and the duck lets it go because it thinks it has learned not to trust these deceptive, shiny illusions in the water, with the result, of course, that it loses an opportunity and gets even more hungry. And the moral of that story is, in that particular case, that even if you have a bad experience a couple of times, always do reflect and do not take it as a universal given moving forward from there.
That is a wonderful story, and I'm sure that our audience will love it too. Because we're discussing symbology, there is an interesting phenomenon I wanted to ask you about. It is often assumed that the cross symbolizes Christendom, the Star of David, Judaism, but it is often said that Islam has no symbol. Perhaps in recent years, product of marketing maybe, the crescent has been associated to Islam. Why is this association?
Yes, today the crescent is popularly understood as a symbol of Islam, but its history is enormously complex and goes back over thousands of years. So when you look at the Quran itself, there is only one reference really to the Hilal, or rather Ahilla, and it occurs in the second chapter in verse 189. And there it says, they ask you, O Muhammad, about the new moons, Ahilla. Say, they are measurements of time for the people and for Hajj. So what that means is that the new moon, the Hilal, the first sighting of the new crescent, is the sign by which people should arrange their time, i.e. organize their calendar. And of course, Muslims still follow, in principle, a lunar calendar. And according to that, establish the important religious landmarks throughout the year, including the Hajj, the pilgrimage, but also other events and other seasons, like very importantly, the fasting month of Ramadan. But in the regions in which Islam came to flourish and expand, of course, ancient civilizations had been engaging with the moon and using the crescent moon as a symbol of, again, higher powers and manifestations for thousands of years. So the crescent was a symbol of moon deities in ancient Egypt, in ancient Mesopotamia, in Iran, and also, of course, around the ancient Mediterranean. And interestingly, there are stories that also liken the waxing and the waning of the moon, which of course always results in a crescent, to the horns of a bull, which in turn was associated with moon deities that were also seen as kind of shepherds that herd their flocks of stars across the night sky. And this kind of pastoral power of moon deities was associated with the power of the kings on earth, the ancient royalty on earth, and their way of running things being an earthly reflection of the timeless order and cycles of the heavens. And later on in Byzantine and Sasanian contexts, we often find the crescent still associated with both religious iconography and also royal iconography. So there is traditionally a link in ancient civilizations between the heavenly spheres and their reflection through the royal rule on earth. So when Islam came along, and of course the actual dogma of the religion started fusing in many ways with the existing cultures and traditions that were inherent to specific regions and geographic areas of the Muslim world, these kind of ancient references, of course, are not eliminated, but they kind of become, if you like, Islamicized and become drawn into the convictions around the moon that I spoke about earlier. So interestingly, if we are looking at it as a specifically Islamic symbol, it seems to first emerge in the 12th century when the Cathedral of Ania in Armenia is converted into a mosque in the 1160s, and the cross on the dome of the cathedral is replaced by a crescent moon. So that is where we seem to find the first kind of direct link between Islam as a religion and the crescent moon motif. And then, of course, this gets consolidated in particular under Ottoman rule, who of course, then came to rule over large expanses of the Islamic world between the 15th and particularly 16th century and the early 20th century. And what is fascinating is that there were thinkers at the time who saw a mystical connection between the letters for the word Hilal and the letters for the word of God, which are identical in Arabic, and are also further identical in the word for tulip. So the crescent and the tulip now occur jointly on many Ottoman artifacts. And there's a theory that it is because of the letters that they share. And over the centuries, you then find that these motifs get carried from the Ottoman heartlands and from the capital of Istanbul across the Near East, Middle East, across Ottoman lands, even into Eastern Europe. And a further dimension that came into this obsession with the crescent moon was that certain descriptions of the Prophet Muhammad also liken him to a moon. And a particular art form became developed in the 17th century by a prominent calligrapher at the time, Hafiz Osman, and that is the so-called Hilya. And the Hilya is basically a word portrait based on an eyewitness report of the Prophet's experience by his cousin and son-in-law Ali. And this eyewitness report, as it were, becomes arranged in a calligraphic tableau, if you like, which has a crescent-shaped circle in the center, and then is framed by 4 other roundels, often incorporating the names of the first 4 rightly guided caliphs. So the first sign of a state flag with the crescent and the star at that point goes back to 1793, when a flag is designed for the Navy. And this flag, which at the time was still green rather than red, then becomes the prototype that later develops into the national flag. And of course, as a result, in the 20th century, then actually gives the inspiration for a whole host of other flags designed by newly independent countries in the Muslim world.
So there are many pieces and objects featuring the moon in the Islamic world, as you mentioned. What is the aspect that you have found most fascinating in regards to the arts?
It's fascinating how embedded it is in all the art forms across cultures and across centuries. And of course, in a way, it's not surprising, because if you come from what I just told you before, and this complex web of beliefs and convictions and preoccupations and scientific fascinations, then it only makes sense that they also somehow find themselves manifested in artistic media. And of course both, and that's very important to remember, in intangible arts and in the visual arts. Because often in the West we tend to focus primarily on material arts and visual arts. But in the pre-modern Islamic world, intangible arts like literature and poetry, and of course to some extent also music, were extremely central as well, and sometimes even more central than some of the physical manifestations that have survived to reflect these preoccupations and tastes to this day. So starting with that particular point, you find a lot of poetic, philosophical, spiritual, and rhetorical allegories reflected in the arts, coming down from poetry and literature. And the most straightforward manifestation in material form, of course, is calligraphy. And we, for one, have a very extensive body of calligraphies in the collection that tend to be focused on mystical poetry and often allude to the moon, and the moon as a metaphor for divine beauty, spiritual beauty, but also physical beauty. So we have references to the beauty and the spiritual beauty of the Prophet Muhammad as likened to a moon, and of course also that moon, because it doesn't really create light of itself but reflects the moon, in that case signifies the Prophet Muhammad as reflecting the divine light that he was honored with. You also have the moon as an image of really very physical beauty, and the ideal in that respect, particularly in the Persianate world, came to be the moon face, Ma Ruh or Ma Ruh. And we have some beautiful lusterwares in our collection, and they were also in the exhibition, that show just such moon-faced personalities. And it's interesting that they are not always clearly identifiable as female, but they are these generic round faces with almond-shaped eyes and then crescentic eyebrows, which again, interestingly, in poetry are often likened to the crescent moon as such. Beyond that, you also find references to the moon, particularly in relationship to its lunar mansions and the astrological star signs and planets, particularly on metalwork. And it's fascinating that we have a proliferation of such artworks between the 12th and the 13th century, particularly in what is now Syria, southeast Turkey, and northern Iraq. And fascinatingly, of course, that is the very region where over centuries, and certainly in pre-Islamic times, you have a very diverse and disparate collection of different religious groups and heterogeneous religious practices, many of which go back to these old moon worship related rituals, cults, and sanctuaries that could be found centuries or even millennia ago. So again, nothing comes out of void, and ancient traditions and cultures often survived and became Islamicized, in particular Muslim cultures. And again, there is evidence that the rulers in that particular area were again compared to the moon as well. So we have the ruler of Mosul, who is called Badruddin Lu'lu, who ruled just until the emergence of the Mughals at his gates, very literally. And Badruddin Lu'lu means basically the moon of religion. And we have many artworks that were commissioned by him or in his realm that make references to the moon and the crescent moon.
Ulrike, this has been a very comprehensive review of a very deep topic. Before we finish, I wanted to make a note. In Islamic art, the moon is female. This is an interesting feature considering the tradition of male moon gods in several parts of pre-Islamic Middle East. How did this occur, and why is it important for us?
Again, the sun, you have to see it in the relation or in reference to the sun and moon dynamic, where the sun is really the harsh, determined powerful but also scary one in many ways, whereas the moon is the gentle, soothing, maternal one in many ways. And the fact that people knew that the moon had a monthly effect on water, on the tides, but also on female cycles, the moon very much became associated with female existence and female cycles. So there was a kind of awareness along those lines. And it's often, as I said, also reflected through the poetry and the qualities that are addressed in the poetry with regard to the moon.
Ulrike, it has been fantastic listening to your story about the research you did at the Al Khamis Museum and all these amazing aspects of the moon, which I think is a symbol we all need to know more about, since it has defined so much the dogmas and folklore of the lands of the Islamic world. I really hope that once this lockdown stage we're going through is over, you can come to Asia House and join us for an event here.
Juan, thank you so much, Lucy. Oh my God, I would so love that. Absolutely. Yeah, anytime. Just give me a plane, I can come on, I'll be there.
I'm sure we'll make it happen. And thank you so much, all of you who listen to us every week. Don't forget to check our website and stay tuned for new content we will announce during summer. I hope you'll stay well and safe.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.